and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Franson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him is Daniel Sanderson, CEO of Planksip, an international philosophy and cultural media outlet, helping emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. Tonight's episode is Technology Today's Forbidden Fruit with Marco Ciappelli.
Good evening, everyone. It's Wade Franson here with Dan Sanderson in the studio for the Created in the Image of God show. We are wondering where on earth Marco Ciappelli is. He's not here in the studio with us, physically or virtually. We didn't have time to generate an AI version of Marco, which might have been appropriate for tonight's show.
Never thought about that, yeah.
But given that Marco is a no-show on the show, we have a show in the can with Dan the Man. So welcome to everyone. Tonight's show will pivot towards a different question. We'll look into getting Marco back for those of you who explicitly came here to see Marco and are now horribly disappointed. Do not despair. We have a great show planned for you. And we're going to invite Dan to explain the tie-in. He was talking with me in the studio just before that. You know, it's fitting that this topic that we're going to cover is in lieu of the question, is technology the forbidden fruit? The topic we're going to cover tonight is, was Heidegger anti-God? Now, Dan, as you may know, is a philosopher. And in the opening segment of the show, we usually dive into the background of the person who is being interviewed. And Dan usually does the honors of introducing that person to the audience. So we're going to switch roles here. I'm going to ask a couple of brief questions about Dan. Most of you know who Dan is. You've seen him on the show. But let's find out tonight what motivated Dan to get into philosophy in the first place. Dan, what motivated you to get into philosophy in the first place?
I love this section of the show because it means all anecdotes are a go. And
they are.
The anecdote for me, which is just a personal story, is I remember sitting in my Toyota Tacoma truck in downtown Vancouver. A friend of mine named Tyler Sitter was still alive. He has since passed away. He passed away probably because of a bad genetic assemblage. He had a lot of genetic issues with him, and his body just was not compatible with reality. So his body kind of just disintegrated at the young age of, I think, 30 or 32. Tyler Sitter was the one that was, I think, responsible, and the spark, ironically, that got me into philosophy, but also the New Atheist movement. I had spent a majority of my young adulthood, focused on business, building a business, and entrepreneurship. And when I reconnected with my friend Tyler, he had, I would say, the equivalent of a undergraduate degree in reading literature, people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, not so much Daniel Dennett, who was the philosopher. And I remember a conversation I had with him, Tyler, where he had said to me he was interested in philosophy. And I think for most people who try and read philosophy, you read one sentence, don't really understand it, you keep reading it, you keep don't understanding it, and you go back, and it's just a series of confusion. And the advice or the wisdom I would get from people who hadn't made the connection was that you just keep trying, you just keep returning to it, maybe take a course in it. I know YouTube is wonderful for summaries and and this type of thing. So when I had gone through that experience, I was tempted to try and figure it out. And I consider myself a smart fellow. I think it's one of my strengths. And so I can be a determined person. If I need to figure out something, I can usually figure it out. And the deeper I dove into the philosophical teachings of our famous intellectuals of our past, the more it started to make sense. And, tonight's show, we're going to be talking about Heidegger. But as people know, I speak a lot about Plato and the ancient Greeks. But it clicked. It clicked. It finally clicked. And I think the progression was conversations about God, and then moving into something that had more of a philosophical underpinning. And I think that's why I wanted to go into philosophy, is I wanted to understand, where does this all come from, right? So, yeah.
So then share with the audience, as a philosopher, who was Heidegger?
Martin Heidegger is part of the group of philosophers that fall into this existential movement. Now, I think that philosophers in general, in order to be a great philosopher, and there's no prerequisite for what I'm about to say, but each philosopher that's an intellectual giant has something that is very, very unique to offer humanity. And it's not necessarily something that's, I would say, most of it's outside of their own will. It's something that they're in the right place at the right time, telling something truthful about society. Okay. And I guess the way I can illustrate this is that I would say that if René Descartes was born 400 years later, would he be quite the contributor to society as he was? He's known as the father of modern philosophy, right? So Martin Heidegger's role in that, I want to frame this in my own perspective. Okay, my own perspective of how I arrange Martin Heidegger in this series of philosophers, these German intellectual philosophers, is that with the emergence of Newton, the world was captivated and fell in love with this idea of deterministic physics. The Newtonian physics was a paradigm shift in human comprehension. Okay. And I think that a lot of philosophers, actually thinkers in general, really thought, hey, I'd like a piece of that action. But you give me a little rope to hang myself here. Karl Marx wanted to do something very similar with sociology. Now, in terms of trajectories or falling bodies, we all understand what physics is, right? Now more so than we did 400 years ago, but it makes sense. It makes sense to you as a man of faith. It makes sense to me as your friend. Okay, so
I was about to say, what are you, Dan?
Yeah, well, we've talked about it, right? It's like, do I believe in God? Then the answer is yes. But I urge people to ask me more about that. So anyways, you have this love affair of somebody that is such an emergent, like is such a phenomenon. Newton was absolutely earth-shattering. Marx tried to do it with sociology. Let's try and make something deterministic. Let's try and encompass everything. And sadly, labor is not the totality of what social systems are, period. I mean, it's that easy for me. So where does this and how does this tie into Martin Heidegger? Well, Martin Heidegger was somebody that I think got caught up in the intellectual milieu of a new German romantic. Okay, there was a movement in Germany that was fueling the potential for something new, a new German superiority. That, in my opinion, blinded this great thinker. He's an incredible thinker. As much as you want and you think you can distance yourself from Heidegger, just spend some time in his work. It's a thicket. It is almost impenetrable. And when you think you've penetrated it, you don't understand it. It's kind of like that maxim about quantum physics. So, am I too early to like kind of lead this into
Not at all.
the Nazi movement and stuff like that?
I was actually going to go there next, but let's just set the context. The time in which Heidegger lived, and began to get involved in academics, was the time when Hitler was rising to power in Germany, right? And that was a massive dragnet that swept everybody up in one way or another, right? There was no way to avoid getting involved in some way with what was happening in that nation.
Yeah.
And that's the context, right? So it wouldn't have been something he went looking for. It's something that, trapped him in a sense and forced him to make decisions one way or another.
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, he was he was like the leader of a major university. I can't remember what they call the headmaster or whatever.
Yeah, it was Freiburg, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and he accepted a position. He accepted the position there. He was part of the Nazi Party. But here's the thing: history can be ruthless, and especially when in association with the Nazis. For everybody to know, Martin Heidegger resigned his position with the Nazi Party prior to Hitler taking power. And I think that the dismissal or the equivocation of Martin Heidegger being a Nazi is just it's I don't know. It's just it's not fair for somebody that actually was quite a brilliant academic, but the thing is it's a little bit like prophecy, right? Not quite, but if you're going to be a prophet, you can't get one thing wrong. One thing wrong, you're not a prophet, right? Like, that's kind of how it works. But we hold our academics, at least these kinds of academics, to like a very, very stringent qualification. Okay, so let's just imagine that there's a swell of social movement now that's starting to happen that may move into something as destructive as Hitler's Germany. Right now, it's relatively benign. It was a labor party. You had a country of Germany that was hungry for a new identity. There was an identity vacuum in that particular period of time. Martin Heidegger's dates were 1889 to 1976. So he died when I was born, basically, like I was born in 1975. We all know about World War II, and we all know about, the atrocities and that type of thing. I think the thing that hits me the most with Martin Heidegger as it approaches the Nazi question is that he never officially condemned the Nazi Party or tried to redeem himself in any way whatsoever, which it seemed would have been so easy. I mean, because he ended up getting his teaching, he ended up becoming a teacher again and stuff like that. But I mean, I think he was suspended for 5 years after the war. But
what was it? What was it about his philosophy and his ideology, if you will, that led him into that trap, if you will, of not being willing or able to so extricate himself?
I don't think the intellectual community holds his work hostage. I think it's just literally the participation. He was drawn to the new movement because I think he wanted to see a different world, and that's a trap that the greatest thinkers among us. That's the lesson. The greatest thinkers among us can go down blind alleys. Because I think and this is very relevant to today's cultural milieu, because I'm a traditionalist. A traditionalist is safe. Populations that advocate revolution and upheaval and turning the status quo, whatever that is, into something new, is too Rousseauian for my liking. It's scary it's scary beyond belief. It's so scary, in my opinion. And yeah.
Well, we had a question from the audience, which I'll just quickly show, from Brian. What is this about? It's possible that Brian tuned in just a moment late. And so let me recap for those who may have joined late. Marco Ciappelli, who was going to talk to us about is technology the new forbidden fruit, is a no-show on the show. So Dan and I had a planned discussion around Heidegger and whether or not he was anti-God. Heidegger, in his early years, was studying to become a priest. So he did have that initial background. He dropped out of that relatively quickly for health reasons, I believe, initially. But we'll get into that as we return now from the commercial break that we are going to go into, typically at this point in time. And because we don't have a guest, we still want to give away a book. So because I'm the host of the show, I'm going to be giving away a copy of my book. So we'll go to this commercial break, which is actually an ad for the first of my 3 books, The People of the Sign. And when we come back, we're going to go on a little bit of a tangent for a couple of minutes and talk about a particular pet peeve that I have right now about cognitive dissonance and get Dan's reaction to it. And then we're going to dive deeper into Heidegger, find out, was he anti-God? Are philosophers more prone to succumbing to their own ego? And other interesting questions. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
What do divorce, kidnapping, ancient prophecies, and the collapse of the Soviet Union have in common with the music of the Beatles? These are all elements of author Wade Franson's traumatic autobiographical journey, recorded in his best-selling book, The People of the Sign. He effortlessly weaves these elements together, proving once and for all that truth really is far, far stranger than fiction. Order your copy now on Amazon or by emailing orders@soupllc.com.
Or by providing a comment in the chat that I like the best tonight for whatever reason, and you will be receiving a free copy of this book. In this book, it goes into a lot of my background, the early questions that arose through my experiences, and diving into those early years and how they make and shape us is one of the reasons why we open the show the way we do, by talking about the background of our guests. So now, a pet peeve that I have right now, which will tie into this idea of succumbing to one's own ego. And Dan, I just really want to get your take on a central theme that we cover a lot on this show from time to time. which is the idea of having our thoughts be coherent, of achieving intellectual coherence between our thought and our action. In Zoroastrianism, there is I think the idea of right thought, right words, and right deeds. Right, that's the basis of that religion. Right actions, having our thoughts be right and pure, having our words be good and pure, and having our actions conform to that. We recently had a deep discussion about how if the spirit and the attitude behind a thing, behind a good work, isn't there, then even good works will aggregate up into corruption. And this is another word for hypocrisy, right? For having some flaw in our thinking that leads us as individuals, and then as families, and then as tribes, and then as cities, city-states, nations, and the whole planet, aggregating up problems. And so one of the things that is on my mind is the issue of borders. We would all like to see a world where we all get along, where there's freedom of movement, where we feel welcome and at home wherever we might travel in the world, that people would welcome us as we travel somewhere else. And we would welcome people that travel here. A borderless world, a utopia. And yet there's this saying about good fences make good neighbors, right? And that in a lot of intellectual circles today, we talk about safe spaces, right? Protected spaces, spaces where one is not confronted with microaggressions, spaces where one is free to be what one wants to be, where everyone is willing to address me by my chosen pronouns, no matter how they may otherwise perceive me. So here's the cognitive dissonance, right? How do we have people who would advocate for there should be no borders, we should have open borders, and people should be able to flood into our country from other nations, while at the same time demanding that I can project my personal space out into infinity, and everybody who meets me, whether it would be from around the other side of the world virtually, I can force them to conform to my personal ideas about how I want to be treated. But I can insist that my nation have open borders and allow people to come in who are of a completely different culture and a completely different behavior, who may not, who in fact, by coming in the way they are doing so illegally, and thus not respecting the boundaries that have been established. So this is like a massive cognitive dissonance between that golden rule of treating others the way I would like to be treated, right? Where there's not an ability to reconcile and have intellectual coherence about this projection of my personal space and how I want to be treated and how I insist everybody around the world would treat me with a degree of dignity and respect, but then demand that the nation of which I'm a part of not have borders. There's got to be some way to reconcile these things, but to me, this is an interesting cognitive dissonance. One might, dare I say, hypocrisy of thought. What's your reaction to this, Dan, as a philosopher?
The picture you're painting for me is national borders, and it has to do with immigration, where the other one that you're pointing has to do with like personal boundaries. And so I see kind of two abstract things. I do see the dissonance, but not quite so starkly as you do.
Well, if so typically it's not the people who live on those borders who are in law enforcement, right? So they're projecting a standard on these other people about what they may or may not allow in their personal space. You follow me? In other words, I'm setting standards that I myself would never go along with. I'm forcing other people to behave in ways that I would not allow myself to be forced to behave.
Right. Well, let's go the Jordan Peterson route on it, right? Because a Canadian psychologist, somebody that basically said, I will not be forced by law, or university law, by law, whatever, in his class to address his students by a preferred pronoun.
And by the way, that's just one example of this thinking of me establishing very clear and very specific do's and don'ts about how other people may treat me, creating a safe space around myself.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. While not allowing the nation to create a safe space for itself, insisting that the boundaries that other people have set up be destroyed, while at the same time insisting on extending and solidifying boundaries that never before existed for the individual.
I have to say, I like how Cameron's really jumping in here. He's in the comments. Sometimes he's somewhat quiet, but he must really like this conversation. We got to have Cameron back too. He's wonderful. I see your point, Wade. I see your point about the maximal individual freedom without boundaries or limitations, but virtually no.
There are a lot of comments coming in, but let's just look at this one. I don't think it's a hypocrisy to ask for social acceptance. Of course not. There's nothing wrong with that. National borders are about boundaries of a society and cultural norms. So why? Yeah, it's a fundamental problem also on the issue of tolerance, right? Tolerance of certain things is demanded, which is intolerance of other things.
I wonder if Cameron, like what Cameron's thoughts, maybe you can mention something, Cameron, about open borders. Like, do you have a defense for open borders? I'm more on Wade's side on the borders. But yet there's the more important or the pressing issue that I see with borders is refugees on one side of a border, starving, struggling, right? This type of thing, and other countries completely fine. And what do we do about that as a world community? But people say there is no world community. There's no world governance. There's no world community. Not if we are, until we're global citizens that are part of a global democracy.
We could go in 100 ways with this.
Yeah.
But I really want to focus on this specific situation of me demanding protective boundaries around myself, my ego, my positions, my perspective, my ideologies, right? Because this extends in the universities to, the freedom of speech and again, safe spaces go in the direction of there are certain things that I should not be subjected to having to hear, right? I want protective boundaries around my ears. I should not be forced to listen to this contrary opinion,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And yet, I insist that the borders be torn down, and then whatever floods in, floods in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So I think Cameron understands what we're getting at and is saying the same thing here. People deserve to have their living space and control over that space. It became sticky in the face of colonialism and oppression. Well, yes and no. I again, not a topic I want to talk about tonight. That's an additional overlay and an element that we could debate how relevant it is and is not to the idea of having a border, right?
Mm.
Given any particular border we might choose to talk about, it may or may not be an issue. I'm talking in the abstract about the idea of a border around a defined group of people, such as a door on a house, a door on a public building, right?
Mm-hmm.
A tax that is levied for the right to live in one place versus another place. All kinds of borders and boundaries. School districts in which your child is eligible because they live in a certain area. And again, that gets sticky too in terms of the history of racial segregation and busing and all that. But in theory, the idea of establishing personal space and personal boundaries while denying that right for any other outside of myself, right? I guess agreement. Anyway, I'll stop trying to further define it and let you respond there, Dan.
I don't know. I'm just going to take a stab at it and say I think you're frustrated at the fact that a strong national identity is something that you would like to have, that is very important to you.
No, I'm not addressing that. I'm not addressing the issue of, I'm addressing the issue of identity on the one hand, because the individual who is insisting on protective boundaries around their identity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I'm glad you raised the issue. So I'm insisting on protective boundaries on me establishing my personal identity,
Mm-hmm.
while rejecting the ability of others to establish a collective identity.
All right, let's approach it this way. I find it a very useful philosophical technique. Thank you, and brought to us via Plato. So trying to understand and taking it from, we'll say, their perspective, okay, and let's open up the space for the individual. I think their idea is that everybody can have a similar amount of respect and social fluidity of non-offensive space. Now, I think that's the point where you say, well, wait a minute, that's actually not possible, because when people congregate, there's always some kind of either a rub, a conflict, there's something. It's just the way it is. There's hierarchies, and so I would take a guess that their ideal is that everybody gets that. If America opened their borders and refugees from around the world just swarmed into America, and it went from 480 million people to 4 billion people, they would maintain that everybody could live in similar kinds of bubbles of equality. And I guess, what other descriptions are we using for that? It's like non-offensive existence, right? And so it's like, the question is like, why can't everybody just do that? Why can't everybody self-proclaim their gender, their socioeconomic status, their just live how they want to? It's almost like avatars or something. Like, if I want to be this, I can be this. If I want to be that, I can be that. Why can't everybody be that? Is that?
Well, here again, Cameron is highlighting one of the aspects of that. There is also an element of social conformity and social norms. So the issue then becomes, I don't like
Social
the
norms and
prevailing
conformity.
social norms.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I want to establish a different social norm.
Yeah.
And the criteria by which I claim moral ascendancy of my social norm is that I was a minority
Mm-hmm.
and I was mistreated as a minority.
Yeah.
And therefore, I claim the right to equality.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that immediately begins to cross a line in which really I'm establishing a new majority so that I can oppress the new minority. And there
It's
is
an
a
artificial propped up majority. It's the
well,
minority ruling the majority, right? 'Cause
well,
it's,
yeah. Well, there is then the identity claim, I guess, once a minority, always a minority, even if my view were to become ascendant, I would still lay claim to the underdog card and insist. You follow me?
yeah.
So I don't know. But to me, the core issue here is getting at that coherence of thought, so that philosophically, to your point, Dan, if I insist on this one kind of tolerance, and then claim what the other person is wanting to have to be an intolerance.
Yeah.
And I can't recognize that these two things are the same, or I can't recognize that these two things are different. Philosophically, how does one address that cognitive dissonance, such that one can come to clarity and coherence on claims? You know, one of the taglines at the opening of this section is investigating reality claims, right?
Yeah. Wade, look, I mean, when I'm confused, and I'll admit, I'm confused, and I get confused if it gets too particular. And so I want to pull back and go to something abstract. Okay. Yeah. And I think this is where you and I could possibly agree 100%. The difference between chaos and order. We have a track record in the West and in Western cultures under a Judeo-Christian hegemony of relative order and prosperity. I, for one, and this may be my cognitive dissonance that you share with me, and we may be in the fishbowl, but I, for one, am looking at what's coming into the future, and it's getting more complex. It's a little scary, and I would rather rely on the order and the tradition that we've laid forward in the past. I'd like to follow that same track, as opposed to trying to reinvent something new based off of the emotions of varying, competing, and this is the key thing, competing populations for ascendancy in relation to other populations. I think it is incredibly dangerous.
Well, and on that note, we're going to go to a commercial break and tie this back into the original topic of, is technology the forbidden fruit? And I think we've got just the right word from our sponsor to bridge that gap. Stay tuned. When we come back, we'll talk more about, was Heidegger anti-God? Are philosophers more prone to succumbing to their own ego? and more. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Artificial morality. The future of AI is rapidly changing, and with it, the future of humanity. How will we approach this transformative technology? Will we make ethical decisions that shape a bright future for all? Or will we be swayed by greed and self-interest? The world's great spiritual teachings offer a path forward, a way to use the tools we create for the betterment of humanity. They remind us that we are all created in the image of God and that our technological advancements must reflect this spiritual reality. In Artificial Morality, Navigating the Ethics of AI with Spiritual Teachings, we present a vision of hope, where technology serves humanity and not the other way around. Join us as we explore this critical topic through stories of inspiration and hope. To submit your own tale of navigating the ethics of AI and become a part of this groundbreaking anthology, simply email us at info@supellc.com.
And there's that QR code if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that anthology. Cameron Cowan is saying he writes about this. Perhaps a contribution from him would be welcome in this anthology. And I'm going to just put that email address in the chat so that you can have it, email us or email Something or Other Publishing, and express your interest in joining the other writers contributing to that anthology. So right before the break, we were talking about hypocrisy, cognitive dissonance. The question there is, are philosophers more prone to succumbing to their own ego, Dan? What do you think?
Oh man, I would say they're human just like the rest of us, and I'd say they can definitely succumb to that quite easily.
Did Heidegger succumb to his own ego in his inability to distance himself from the Nazi Party? Was there some
I think so, absolutely.
strain of
Absolutely.
purity in
Yeah.
his conception of right and wrong, and that he painted himself into a corner, or as the Germans might say, konnte nicht über seinen eigenen Schatten springen. He was not able to jump over his own shadow.
Quite possibly. I think he was on a journey of self-discovery with his work that was looking for something different, and he was very much the product of a society, as we all are to some degree. And Wade, you'd said a while ago that we all think we're right. Now, if the universe conspires in such a way as to line up just a few more of your, I don't know what we would call them, the way you see the universe unfolding, right? It'd be like a quickening. It'd be like, yeah, I saw this coming. I agree with this. I'm right. And so I think if we have a reinforcing mechanism that we look out into society and we see the way we interpret the world as being right, but if we get reinforcement about us being right, then it continually feeds back in on itself. The good part of religious structures, I would say, is that they have a beauty of wisdom that explains and prompts for humility and prompts for altruistic the opposite of a self-serving act, right? For the greater good, this type of thinking. And we step away from that at our peril. We we are given everything that we need to make, I guess, like healthy, happy choices for a thriving community. And we will constantly stray from the flock, to use the analogy of the sheep. We will constantly do that. And so what brings us together? Well, I mean, a secular society will say secular values. A religious society will say religious values. Immanuel Kant will say, well, that's just, it's a categorical imperative, which means it's just in us. I'm like, well, the religious guy will come back and say, yeah, and I know what that inside of us is. Right? It's the divine spark of God Almighty.
You know, I'm an advocate of religion in the sense I would like to see people connected with their divine nature and with the divine nature with a capital D and a capital N. You might just say their higher self and the order of the universe. So religion could be interpreted as a set of agreed upon behaviors to which we all strive to conform, right? There's a quote in a Baha'i text that says, it's basically, to whose commands we are all conforming, right? We are seeking to align ourselves with the divine will. In the Baha'i faith, the marriage vow is simply the man and the woman, because marriage is between a man and a woman in the Baha'i faith, as it is in most religions historically. The vow that the marriage partners say to each other is simply, we will all verily abide by the will of God. And in one sense, we have no choice but to abide by the will of God. There might be different interpretations on how long the leash is that God has us on, right? The will of God is that we have free will, that we are able to make our own choices, that God will not coerce us, that he has created a universe that happens to have laws. You mentioned Newtonian physics, and you talked about the energy that was unleashed when Newton had his aha moment and declared a new aspect of reality that had not previously been understood, and how that energized all of humanity in various ways to have discovered what was always there.
Yeah.
And thus to unleash the power, as it said in that ad a little bit ago, of creating tools, right, that hopefully would be used for good, but we know they're not always used for good. Once the discovery was made, you know, Prometheus, you referred to Prometheus as well, right? And fire being stolen from the gods. Once that was achieved, like anything else, we were allowed to use it for good or evil. And we're still trying to figure out the thing that Eve was so attracted to, which is the desire to understand good and evil, right? She ate of the forbidden fruit, you know, going back to the original show we were planning to have with Marco Ciappelli, is Technology, Today's Forbidden Fruit. She desired the forbidden fruit because, as she said, it was to be desired to make one wise. And with the serpent whispering in her ear, you will become like God, knowing good and evil. And God knows this, and he doesn't want you to have it. That's why he told you not to eat the tree. Well, no, the truth is God does want us to have that. Paul, the apostle, later clarified, strong meat belongs to those who by reason of use have exercised their senses to discern good and evil. So absolutely, we would desire to understand the nature of the universe and also the nature of good and evil, but we're still figuring it out. There's a swirl still around what's right and wrong. A lot of the debate around the topic we just had a few minutes ago about personal borders, personal boundaries, personal space, and societal boundaries, or you might say group boundaries, agreed upon boundaries of a collective. the debate around that and the cognitive dissonance around that is all caught up in questions of morality and who's right and who's wrong and who's in power, who's oppressed and who's not oppressed.
Mm.
And you know, and there's contention. The world's peoples are contending over these issues. You know, what would Heidegger make of today's world in which these questions continue to swirl, and or other philosophers?
He was very much against the technology. He would have liked humanity to return to a pre-Socratic, more of a being with nature, more of a I don't know. Let's just to get the point across, because I think it ties into what you were saying about Adam and Eve. More of just a being with, and I think there may even be the implication not so much of cognitively thinking about what is right and wrong, just that there's something in our nature that we could return to, kind of like Rousseau in a way, right? Like if you would just let us return to nature, we would be fine, right? We don't need a guiding Leviathan or social contract to keep us on true north, right? Basically, morally.
Well, does that tie into the idea of a noble savage?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, it does. It does. Exactly. That's exactly what it is. And, you know, I'm not opposed to it, but it's so far away in terms of speculation of not only how to get there, but where that's not our society. So it reminds me too much of societal collapse, right? It's like you trade something in a social contract. You trade the freedoms of a civilized nation, and nation is the key, because this is where, and I'm agreeing with you in many cases, Wade, a nation is where, and I'd say for the time being, I'm not saying in 5,000 years, maybe we socially adapt and move into a borderless utopia.
I agree.
Possibly, but we're just not ready for it.
I agree that there's a progression, there's an evolution.
Yeah.
That gets us there, in the same way that when I was living in Europe for 10 years, you were free to travel in and out of all these different countries in Europe in ways that had not previously been possible.
Yeah.
But there was a certain homogeneity amongst these nations. They had achieved a similar set of values and norms that enabled them to allow people that were not going to disrupt and violate. Forget about microaggressions, creating macroaggressions, theft, disruption, chaos, murder.
Well, what I like about the underlying normative world order, right? Okay, that the world traveler gets to experience is that even in some, there's the outliers, right? It's very difficult to just go on a vacation to North Korea, right? I mean, that's kind of a difficult one. Afghanistan's kind of difficult. Okay, there's a few other ones that are kind of difficult to do that as a tourist. There are a few countries that may have local conflicts, but there was an understanding that tourism and money coming in from outside countries was a positive net benefit. And so, you know, we've talked about this before, that the "In God We Trust" on the US dollar bill has a way of solving some issues, right? Okay. That means
I'm not sure what you're referring to, because I usually joke and say there's a missing word on that dollar bill. The word "this" is missing. In this God we trust, right?
Yeah.
In other words, the money is the God. Right?
Yeah, I would say Yeah, I get your point. I kind of get both of those scenarios, but what I'm saying is that if you have a country that may be prone to more, like you were talking about theft or some issues of like, it can be a quite unstable. If the political powers, they try and kind of squash that because they realize that international travel and tourism is a good thing. So they want to keep that out. They want to
Oh yeah,
want to
but
protect the.
while I was in Europe equally, I did what was really an amazing experience. I think it was in 1985. I traveled to East Germany
Yeah.
and I crossed Checkpoint Charlie.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And Checkpoint Charlie was the checkpoint in East Berlin, between West Berlin and East Berlin,
Uh-huh.
in which there was a corridor that you walked through, and there was a no man's land of cement and barbed wire and glaring spotlights and automatic machine guns. So you were literally walking across a border that if anyone tried to cross that border, they would be mercilessly mowed down.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And this border was erected by the people on the eastern side of that border
Yeah.
to prevent the intercourse of those peoples. And my cousin in Sweden used to joke about the Baltic. And he said, you see that submarine over there? Of course, you couldn't see the submarine, it's underwater. But you see that submarine over there? It's patrolling the waters of the people's paradise to make sure that the people from the West can't get in.
Huh.
Right? It was his joke, obviously, right? The
Yeah.
workers' paradise has to patrol their border to
Yeah.
keep the people from the West from getting into the workers' paradise.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
So that highlights this ideological difference, and in a sense, a very negative aspect of borders. But that one was the opposite of what you normally think of. They were trying to keep people out too.
Mm.
But almost everything that was erected and paid for and built and managed and maintained was not intended to keep things out, but to keep the people in.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're showing both sides, right? And maybe we could settle on saying, well, borders are a temporary thing until such time as we are mature enough as a society to take them down, and we'll know when that time is. I don't know. I mean, it's just, I think that's not the right time. Was there a reason? Was it the time for an east and west border? Was it necessary for the particular? I mean, most people know the story, right?
Well, and there are different kinds of borders, right? There are many different kinds of borders, as we were discussing a little while ago, right? Anyway.
Yeah.
At the most basic level, and this is, to me, a defining perspective. The cells of our body, our bodies are made up of all these different cells, and in fact, different ecosystems of different types of creatures live within us. We have tribes of billions of bacteria that are not us.
Yeah.
But that coexist with us, within us, and help us, and without which we could not survive and we would die. Right?
Yeah.
These bacteria that populate, then we have different kinds of blood cells, white blood cells, red blood cells, and they have completely different functions. Brain, anyway, but the basic building principle of a cell is you've got DNA, you've got RNA, and then you have a semi-permeable cell wall. And the RNA can interact with the external environment. It can look out beyond the cell wall and interpret the environment and give feedback and instruction to the DNA to tell the DNA what to do. The traditional understanding of DNA is false. DNA as a determinant, as determining everything. It's more complex and more beautiful than that. The RNA interprets the environment and gives instructions to the cell what to do. But that semi-permeable membrane, that cell wall, is critical to the survival of the cell. And the RNA helps determine what to let in and what to let out. And the DNA helps build and maintain the structure, the identity of the cell.
Yeah, so there's a biological border. And you actually made me think of the pleasure-pain threshold. And this is part of what defines the individual, right? I mean, if you get a little bit abstract and say what defines Wade, you say there's like, there's an entity, there's an agent walking around in a physical body, and you know when Wade stops and Wade begins, right? I mean, you know from the sensation on your skin, you know from the clothes you wear, you know, right? My proximity to you, if we're in the same room, we know when we cohabitate that proximity bubble. We know when two people are, you know, there's this border, right? And I think that's a very interesting, and I urge people to, if they're interested in this type of thing about cells in particular and homeostasis and the biology of felt experience, I would encourage anybody and everybody to check out Antonio Damasio. He's a neuroscientist and brilliant in that area.
Well, I'd like to go to sort of a commercial break here, but actually I'm going to go on a detour again. This is a more ad hoc, spontaneous show. And I want to tee it up by saying that what we have done on our property here in conjunction with the Royal Falcon Foundation is to establish youth camps, right? Where we're trying to teach leadership principles to 11 to 15-year-olds. And we have a couple of videos, and I'm going to show one now that's about, well, I'll show the first couple of minutes of it.
I have to give you a little bit of a praise, because Wade does not like tooting his own horn. It's remarkable what you're doing, Wade. It's really, really good. So on that precipice, or on that, I guess, like introduction, let's see the video.
I have to do a little bit more teeing up first, and that is that this fall we took the kids to an external camp called That Zen Farm, where Marcy, the woman who owns that, has 19 therapy horses. And she does something called Gestalt therapy. Gestalt therapy. Gestalt being a German word. Does it mean being? Is that?
No, Gestalt's very interesting. Gestalt means like filling in the blanks. So let's say you had only little bits and pieces of something. What you Gestalt is you fill it in. The mind can fill in like the whole picture.
So you're completing the picture by adding that which was missing, kind of?
Yeah.
So anyway, Marcy taught the kids, and this is why this sparked the thought here, taught the kids that the horse is a prey species. It has eyes on the sides of its head. We didn't get her explaining this part. That's why I'm having to share it. But that was part of what she did with the kids, is to teach the kids that the horse is a prey species. It is preyed upon. Not that it's preying, but it is preyed upon.
It's a religious show. You don't ever know.
Yeah, and
we're horsing around.
Yeah, and we are a predator species. We have eyes in the front of our head. We go directly at the thing. Whereas prey species, they have eyes on the other side so that they can have more of a 360 view. They won't get snuck up on from behind as easily. And so she said, you have to approach the horse from the side.
Mhm.
so as to keep it calm. You don't go straight at the horse,
Mhm.
and you don't go too fast, and you don't go too slow. You're not aggressively going towards the horse, and you're not sneaking up on the horse.
Mhm.
You are just. So she taught us, and I wasn't a student, but I was listening in intently and learning. She taught the kids how to be with the horses and how to use their body language and so on to lead them around. And the other reason I want to share this is that the focus is on experiential learning. And I'm going all over the map here. I do this a lot. I weave in a lot of things, but the point that I'm now making is that there's this big debate in Christianity, and the debate is faith versus works, right? And you know, all you need for personal salvation is faith in Jesus. Well, the issue that I personally have with that is, first of all, it's essentially selfish. Why are you overly concerned about your personal salvation, right? Because the golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And, Jesus said, why do you claim to love God whom you have not seen when you don't love your brother whom you have seen, right? And this excessive focus on one's personal salvation and the corresponding professions of faith, where you are mouthing words intended to establish your faith or your righteousness. It's a religious, spiritual virtue signaling. Instead of recognizing that only deeds of stainless purity are acceptable before God. The words of your lips, Jesus said, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things that I say?
Mm-hmm.
What are our actions? Actions speak louder than words. So the whole program is designed to be experiential. And I'm just going to share now a little bit to sort of put my money where my mouth is and show this is what we're doing in terms of trying to teach and grow and build in young people the ability to transcend the issues and challenges of today and to build a better world. I'll need to just share the screen, and hopefully this will work. Tell me, Dan, if you do not hear the sound as well.
I will.
This fall camp was really a continuation of what we've been building over the last couple of years. This camp's challenge course was the Animal Kingdom Challenge course. And so the 9 checkpoints each had to do with a different species and learning about that species and how that species has achieved excellence within the ecosystem. We're going to start here with the dogs. Dogs like to be playful. So you're going to play a game of fetch.
It was a simple game where they just had to toss a ball to each other and catch it over a line, but there were no instructions given, and there's not always instructions given in life, so they had to ask questions until they were able to figure out what the game was like.
During some of the workshops today, while half the camp was doing the challenge courses, we had the gardening program where we harvested using the potatoes to make French fries. What's really unique and different to this camp is that we really want no more than 10% talking. And then they're doing things, right? Deeds, not words, be your adorning. One of the things that was important to us was expanding further out into the community. So we started asking who else in the community is doing things and might be interested in working with us.
I'm Marcy. I own that Zen farm. My husband and I own this farm. Today, I'm going to have you start by becoming part of the horse herd. We're going to do an obstacle course using your body energy and your body language to move the horse. The first tool you're going to use is called the curry comb. Nice, yep, take your time, go round and round.
Like trying to gain their trust by like touching them and letting them like get our sense.
Now the next part, which is how do we use our bodies and our energy to move the horses?
RC provided an experience where you taught them how to really be aware of their bodies and their breaths, and that would help them to lead the horses.
You want the horse's head slightly in front of you. Nice. Exhale and stop your feet. Excellent.
The leadership component was taking young men and women who are 11 to 15 and showing them that they have the energy to lead this 1,000-pound animal around and even take it through an obstacle course. And that was quite an experience for all the participants this year.
I love that. It's great.
So I just thought it was interesting in talking about how we have different ecosystems even within us. We are at the pinnacle of creation. The name of the show is Created in the Image of God. Striving to fulfill a spiritual destiny, striving to transform the world into the Garden of Eden. Earlier, Cameron, who was very active in the chat, said something here. Where is it? Here it is. I think the whole idea that we have to return to something has always struck me as odd. And I don't think of it so much as returning to the Garden of Eden, rather transforming the entire planet into the Garden of Eden, right? Into a symbiotic relationship. I've said so often the first two commandments were dress and keep the garden and be fruitful and multiply. Setting off a yin-yang challenge to simultaneously become the most invasive species the world had ever seen, while protecting and preserving the planet and all the other species. To be the king, the top of the food chain, the pinnacle of creation, but with the intent of dressing and keeping the garden. Yes, subduing the earth, but not oppressing the earth. Cultivating the earth, turning the earth into an even more beautiful garden than that which it would be on its own without us. In that sense, even improving upon the creation, which gets back to that whole thing of technology and AI, right? And are we turning it into a Frankenstein monster, or are we having it actually serve a higher purpose? And it's easy to get wrong, apparently.
I'm pretty progressive on technology. I think it's not so scary as it's portrayed, but that's just my intuition. That's my gestalt. That's how I gestalt.
Is that because your kids were grown up before the cell phones were introduced, Dan?
Oh yeah. I see your point. I don't know. I remember being on a plane with my boys and looking at a 2-year-old natively navigating an iPad, right? I mean, and I had the idea that as I was parenting, that this is the world of technology is what we live in, and I'd like to see them gain native skills using technology to problem solve. The problem lies if in a potential collapse. I know I've talked about that before, and I may be overreacting, but if there's a collapse, then we have a culture that doesn't understand how to do simple things. And without technology, once it's turned off, right? So
I hear you, but I think there's a certain Pollyannish naivete around celebrating the beauty of a 2-year-old being able to play with an iPad. Because look at the so-called generation of the lost boys, right? Where you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of young men who have just become immersed in that technology, and they're spending their lives in the virtual world, where they can control the circumstances and think they are winning at something, i.e. the games that they're playing in the virtual world. And they're feeling a sense of empowerment and self-actualization by adopting avatars and, becoming the person who succeeds in killing everybody else in Fortnite. And, doing this day after day after day, hour after hour.
Yeah.
And that's what those 2-year-olds on the iPads often, I'm not saying always, but often grow up to be.
Yeah, I know there's a difference, but I want to paint in a slightly different perspective. I think maybe one that I picked up from Steven Pinker. And as you're a little bit older than me. I made the mistake. I said, "Oh, Wade, you're about the same age as me, right?" And he laughed. Anyway, so here we are. As we're aging, we're becoming the wise part of the generation, and something like Pinker said, we're less susceptible to novelty. Remember the old days, and back in the good old days, this kind of like mentality starts to sink in. And I remember when I was just a wee lad, there were little video games that came out, or Q*bert or Pac-Man, and Grandpa was like, "You're wasting all your time, and you got to stop playing those video games. They're going to eat away your brain," and all this kind of stuff, right? There's nothing wrong with, well, there's lots wrong with me probably, but there's nothing wrong with an entire generation that grew up with Atari, or grew up in arcades. Remember, they used to have these places where you played pinball and stuff like that. Oh, he's wasting and spending all his money in the arcades. So Wade, help disentangle then versus now. How much further down the rabbit hole are we? Are we deluded ourselves? Are we swimming in our own cognitive dissonance? And how do you know that? How do you know that we are or we're not? Are we the same old people complaining about back in our day? What do you think?
I think there are serious problems in society that are getting worse. I think it's hard to say exactly what the cause of these things is. And what degree technology, or the specific example I gave of, Fortnite, plays into it. You've always had people who, maybe underperformed what their potential was in life by one person's standard. Before the iPhone. But I think as a parent, and I am older than you, but my kids are younger than yours by quite a bit. And so I do read up, and I do study the impact of the internet, the impact of technology like the iPhones, and look at the vast numbers of disorders that are emerging, and what's going on in the schools, and even what we try to encounter in our summer camps. And yeah, there is a difference. There is a difference. I am concerned. Based on all the information that I gather as a parent who wants to inform himself about how I can best serve my children.
Community.
Well, and I went through, getting back to my book, I went through some very difficult times as a child. I ended up in Sweden living with my aunt and uncle. My uncle was an alcoholic who was into pornography, and I discovered his stash as a kid, as a young boy. And ultimately, that led to a struggle early on that I had, that I ultimately felt because of my religious training, I was better off saying no and distancing myself from that. And it was a struggle, but it wasn't as pervasive, and it wasn't at my fingertips every second of every day.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the opioid epidemic, for example, which I've been watching some shows on Netflix. There are a couple of really good ones. There's one about the Sackler family. I think it's called Painkiller. And then there's another one called The Pharmacist, which talks about this guy in Louisiana whose son was killed in a drug situation that led him into trying to figure out what was going on in his community. So he had an early look into exactly how the opioid epidemic grew in this country, and how doctors were creating pill mills, and how this, company in particular, Purdue Pharma, had mastered the art of making the creation of heroin addicts legal through the medical system to create many, many billions for themselves. So they became a national drug pusher who changed the nature of how doctors treated patients around the issue of pain. And those familiar pain charts where it says, what is your level of pain today on a 0 to 10? These were introduced as a way to sell those pills. Because if you could self-diagnose your condition, i.e., I am on a scale of 9 today, 9 out of 10 pain,
Mm-hmm.
I could then self-diagnose myself as needing heroin.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young kids were killed in the opioid epidemic. Just, even a cursory examination into that will show you that, yeah, it got a hell of a lot worse for anyone who just opens their eyes and looks at it. But you have apologists, you have people who are saying, no, they were actually trying to help people. They were just really trying to, take care of people's pain. People shouldn't have to experience pain. We have these drugs available that would help, these miracle wonder drugs that will solve the problem of pain. And they were turning an entire nation into heroin addicts. Anyone that fell into that trap, which many did because it was deemed to be medicine, it was deemed to be science, and all it was greed and corruption, enslaving tens of millions of people in the service of enriching certain people that had found a way to make pushing heroin legal.
Yeah.
And so I'm saying that there is an equivalence here to the whole screen thing and the addictive nature of the power of that technology. And, I grew up on Pong, and then this little game in the arcade where you had these this one little ship that could fly around and target this other little ship, and then asteroids, and then Space Invaders. Space Invaders was the first arcade game that really hooked me.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't tell you how much money I plugged into that game in the form of quarters back then, playing Space Invaders. And, at that point in time, everything was about, getting off work and going to Shakey's Pizza where they had a Space Invaders machine and standing there for 2 hours playing Space Invaders. But again, it wasn't coupled with all these other things where, and then the pandemic and forcing everyone to stay at home. And, with what are you going to do all day? Well, there it is. And all kinds of other things thrown into this mix that, quite frankly, I do fear for the youth of our nation. And I do worry and am concerned about what it's doing to their cognitive abilities, to their abilities to explore the deep ethical, moral, philosophical questions.
Mm-hmm.
Versus the instant access of dopamine in the form of highly sophisticated games and entertainment and algorithms that feed us. I see how my kids, can't, we have to set down rules and laws. You will not use your phone in the morning until you leave the house. You're not going to come to the breakfast table and sit there with your phone. You're just not. And it's a constant daily struggle because it is so addictive.
Yeah.
And whether it permanently harms them or not, I think Cameron again made a cogent point here. Blame a society that left them behind. Well, this society created the iPhones and everything that goes along with it, and created this technology and created the entertainment. And we have to like force our kids to sit down and have a game night where we play a board game as a family, where we're actually interacting with each other instead of everyone sitting there on their device, isolated while thinking they're connected.
Yeah.
And I think this whole, circling back, this whole thing about my safe space and being concerned about microaggressions and not wanting to hear anything that is different from what I already believe, and that somehow that is violence. It's violence if I have to listen to your contradictory opinion. Where does that come from? I think the technology definitely plays into that.
Yeah.
Which I'm not saying that society is the great Satan either. I mean, I'm not saying that the technology is the great Satan either. I have 3 screens right here on my desk right now, and 2 computers, and I have a headset and a microphone, and I have a phone over here, and I got more over there. I've got my Mac over there that has my iTunes on it. And we've got a TV. We're surrounded by technology. I'm not a Luddite. But yet I'm aware of what it's also doing.
Yeah. I mean, I can't argue with you on that. It's what to do about it is the question. And do we inspire people away, or do we coerce them away? That's maybe the real question.
Do you build a wall to keep people in or keep them out?
Yeah. Your comment earlier about the opiate crisis. Now, this is something that just kind of caught me by chance. So I quite often go to movies with my boys. It's kind of the thing we do. And we're at the theater, and car commercials, right? Automakers make pretty swanky car commercials. And I feel that economies can move in certain directions based off of where the auto industry is going, right? I mean, the auto industry is just a massive, massive indicator of economies, right? Okay. And I'm going somewhere with this, but what I noticed is that in that same space where you typically see automakers, there was then pharmaceutical companies. And I was like, have we arrived at the place where the pharmaceutical sales and profits are really driving the economy and, driving the economy? And then that felt scary. Right. That really felt scary, because there's it's not conspiracy, but there's
well, look, and you raise a really interesting question, and you may want to take this up with Steve Keen on that other show, but I just recently read about several hundred hospitals closing in the United States, and there's apparently 600 more on the verge of bankruptcy. And I didn't dig into it too deeply, but in essence, the cost of medicine is pricing itself out of rural communities, right? Nobody can afford it anymore. I hit a deer with my car the other night.
Oh shit!
And I was not going fast, and there was a deer in front of me, and I swerved to the left to miss it just as the other deer was jumping out, because I live a little bit out in the country. Just as the other deer her best friend was jumping out into the side of my car. And And by the way, the deer walked away. I don't know if it ultimately survived, but so I thought, well, I've got $1,000 deductible. I'm going to just go get an estimate. I'm not even going to make an insurance claim because I don't want my insurance prices to go up. And I thought, looking at the damage, I thought this might be $1,000. And my friend said, no way, that's at least 4,000. I said, you're probably right, but I'm going to go. Well, guess what? It was $9,000. And one of the reasons it was $9,000 was it's a new car. And it's a 4Runner. It's like a big tank, actually. And it's good for out here in the country where we can't even get up our driveway in the winter without it. But so it's got all the fancy new technology, and it's got a screen right there in front. It's got a 360-degree camera so that you can see all around the car when you're parking, and it's good for radar and, not hitting the car in front of you and all these electronic warnings and everything. The camera, the 360-degree camera is still 100% functional. The camera was not affected at all by this. But on the estimate, there were 2 line items around the camera totaling $1,200 to recalibrate the cameras and the 360-degree camera. $1,200 just to basically refocus the camera, because they got to shut it all off during the repair, and then they got to turn it back on, and then they got to recalibrate it. So $1,200 basically just to, get your camera working again, where the camera's not even broken.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so the cost of this is rising astronomically. And so all this equipment is being bought for all these hospitals, and nobody can afford it. And insurance, costs are going through the roof to pay for all this. And every time you go in for any kind of anything, they send you to 3 expert to have an MRI and to have, the electrocardiogram, and all this technology has to be deployed to diagnose and analyze you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's exorbitantly expensive.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons why these hospitals are going bankrupt, because the cost is just rising astronomically.
Yeah.
And so to your point, yes, all of that stuff is driving the economy, and none of it is productive.
Well, and I think, we in this show, we stay away from like political divisions, but I do feel that there is one side in particular that really voices strong opinions for more financing and support in hospitals and schools and these types of things. And although on the surface that sounds like a great idea, you bring up a really interesting point about either just the way the flow of dollars get utilized and inefficiently maximized, right? There's no accountability. It's just like a black hole, a sinkhole.
Yep.
So then it gets even more politically entrenched, right?
Yep. Circling back just a little bit on this topic we had before. Thank you, Marilyn, for weighing in here. ADHD in children has increased dramatically due to instant feedback from devices. And imagine being a teacher today, having to compete with that, having to create an environment in the classroom. And of course, they do deploy technology to a degree to make the classroom more interesting. But look what you're competing with today.
Yeah.
As a teacher, to try to captivate and hold those minds. That's why, again, in the camps that we do, it's so experiential. Just by way of positivity here, I'm gonna quickly share the rest of that video, and then we're gonna call it a day, because we're rambling all over the map. Hopefully, people are finding it interesting. I certainly am. But I want to also make sure that we look through the comments, pick a winner, and get to the end of the show here. So we're just going to watch the end of this video here so people can see where we went with the rest of the camp in terms of experiential learning.
At the Hillcrest Orchard Camp, people feel excited to contribute. They want to be a part of a community that's more united and loving and accepting and welcoming of anyone from any perspective or any race, religion. And I think, again, they're inspired to help and be of service.
You know, it's a blessing to be able to teach kids, and it's one of the ways that we can make sure that the world will continue to prosper even after we're gone.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited about how this camp turned out. We accomplished a lot in just 2 days. We anticipate being able to grow the camp substantially next year. We're really refining and honing the activities so that you can basically throw them into a suitcase, you know, fly to a different city and help somebody else establish a program like this. We're wanting to make sure that other people that are interested to contact us, let us know, we'll help you launch and establish a camp like this in your local area.
I'm just looking at the chats. It's kind of a back and forth tennis match here.
Well, Cameron's kind of an insider, and he definitely was worthy of getting that free book.
That's for sure, yeah.
But he's kind of an insider as well. Ralph had many, many comments.
How do you
I'm
pick
sorry,
which-
you and I were talking earlier about a certain guest who had a perverse sense of humor. Well, I'm now going to show mine. I'm going to invite Brian Norfleet to reach out to me
Okay.
and claim his book for the comment
That's
of
funny,
the
right?
evening.
Yeah.
What is this about?
And he's even doing this, right? So it's like, there's Brian Norfleet. You just won a book.
You know, and the reason is, Brian, that if you read The People of the Sign, you'll know what this is about. So congrats to Brian Norfleet. Contact us at info@souplc.com to claim your free copy of The People of the Sign. Do you agree with my choice there, Dan?
Well, I mean, I think that's great. I like how you just pulled it out like that. Made a decision. I'll stand by you.
What is this about?
Yeah, what is this about? Yeah, it's a good philosophical question.
Well, thank you all for joining us this evening for the impromptu semi-planned discussion on Heidegger. We never did really answer the question about whether Heidegger was anti-God. So in the remaining moment, yay or nay, Heidegger, anti-God, yay or nay?
I think he was yay.
He was anti-God?
No, he was. I hate those double negatives. I think he was a God-loving.
My kids used to like to play opposite day.
Yeah.
No means yes, yes means no.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for being my compadre in crime. Thank you, Cameron, for keeping the conversation going. Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Ralph Shoemaker. There were many, many comments from Ralph Shoemaker here too, which we didn't end up sharing. But Ralph goes back. He may even predate me, or at least he was in a very rural area that when he was young, they didn't have a landline, let alone a cell phone. And here's another one from Ralph. He had many interesting comments. But you know, I think that one asking that crucial question, what is this about? What's it all about? Well, and with that, my friends, I will say, why can't I get rid of Ralph's comment now? I just clicked hide, but there we go. Good night, my friends. I hope you will tune in next week. And now I have to do the obligatory, well, what will next week be about? And I have to quickly find that. So next week, if she shows up, which I'm sure she will,
She's
it will
lovely.
be Anne Kay Fraley, an amazing woman, mother, and author, right, of science fiction, Christian-inspired science fiction. She may be an emerging C.S. Lewis. She's written a number of books. She's raised 8 children. And she has written a number of science fiction and fantasy novels that address her Christian faith. Anne K. Fraley will be here with us next week. And we will be talking about her experience, her work, and what does faith really look like? And what does courage really look like for a woman who has been through those things that she has and come out on top? We hope you will join us. And until then, Dan, any last words of wisdom?
Nope. Anne's lovely. Read one of her books and looking forward to next week.
Wonderful. See you all then, same place, same time. Come prepared, bring your friends, and we'll be giving away a copy of one of Anne's books. See you then. Until then,